We're now in Acts chapter 18, continuing in the book of Acts. And as you remember, last week we saw a presentation on the city of Corinth, the ruins of Corinth. In the video, they showed the Bema seat, they showed the various temples that had been destroyed, and all the archaeology digs and so on that are going on in Corinth. It was very, very interesting to help us get in our mind a picture of what this city used to look like. So now here we come to chapter 18 in Acts. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. So remember, we last left Paul. He was in Athens. And from Athens to Corinth is about 60 miles. And it doesn't tell us if Paul walked this 60 miles or if he took a ship. Now, oftentimes when Paul gets on a boat in the book of Acts, it tells us that he took such and such a ship. But it doesn't say that here. And the ship would have been taken about 5 hours to travel from the city of Athens to the city of Corinth. Now walking would have taken some days to go across it, maybe 2 or 3 days. And that would have been a very dangerous journey to walk, because from Athens to Corinth goes along a high cliff, along a high bluff with a narrow trail at the top of the bluff and a rock wall on one side and a sheer drop off to the ocean on the other side. It was famously known as a place for robbers to rob people and toss their body into the ocean. So that would have been a very dangerous journey. And Paul was by himself. His companions had left him in Athens and gone back to Thessalonica or Philippi or Berea. And so they were not with him. Paul was by himself in this journey. So Paul, verse 2, comes to Corinth and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla. So the first person Paul meets when he comes into Corinth is a fellow Jew. Now, Aquila and Priscilla would become lifelong friends of Paul. As we're going to continue to read in the book of Acts, Aquila and Priscilla stayed with Paul throughout his ministry in Corinth and then traveled with him when he went to Ephesus. And they stayed in Ephesus, Aquila and Priscilla did, while Paul went on to Jerusalem and in Antioch. They stayed in Ephesus and ministered there. And then later in Paul's ministry, they traveled to Rome with Paul. And at the end of 2 Timothy, the last letter Paul wrote, he writes in 2 Timothy chapter 4 to encouragement to Aquila and Priscilla, these ministers, these faithful friends over more than 15 years of ministry, that Paul developed a deep friendship with Aquila and Priscilla. Now, notably, Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned 5 or 6 times, and most of the time, the wife is mentioned first. Priscilla is mentioned first ahead of her husband. Now, Priscilla is a familiar form of Prisca, a more formal name, a Roman name, indicating that Priscilla would have been a person of some means or a wealthy person, had some standing in society. And so her husband likely also had some standing in society. And the fact that they were able to travel freely around the empire gives us some idea that they had money as well. So Aquila and Priscilla, these people are very well regarded in the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek Orthodox priests are married. The Roman Orthodox priests are not married. So in the Greek Orthodox tradition, they look to Aquila and Priscilla as their example of a priest being married. And so they consider that not any kind of hindrance, to be married, not any kind of hindrance to ministry. And if you look on the front of your bulletin, there is an iconography of Paul with Aquila and Priscilla, and you notice something unusual about this piece of art, that sitting on Priscilla's lap is a baby. So we don't often think of babies being in ministry, but this was an important component of the tradition in the Greek Orthodox Church, of having the baby and Priscilla having this baby. So this is a very important couple in Paul's life and in the history of the church, Priscilla and Aquila. Now Aquila was from Pontus, Pontius was an empire north in the northern part of Turkey, around the Black Sea area, that was conquered by Rome. So Rome conquered the empire of Pontius, and so they were part of the Roman Empire, and this Jew, Aquila, came from Pontius. He traveled to Rome, so we're going to see in a minute, and when he traveled to Rome, he had to leave Rome because, at the end of verse 2, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. So Aquila, somewhere in his life, he met his wife. He traveled from the Black Sea area to Rome. He met Priscilla. They got married, and now they're in Rome. So Claudius, I have his title written down here on this piece of paper. Claudius's title was Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. kind of a mouthful. Claudius was the fourth emperor of the Roman Empire. The first emperor was Octavius. After Julius Caesar was assassinated by the Senate, the Senate was threatened by Julius Caesar's wanting to move the Roman Empire towards a monarchy, and so the Senate killed Julius Caesar, and in his will, Julius Caesar named his grandnephew Octavius as his heir, his sole heir and benefactor, and surprised everyone because everyone thought that Mark Antony was going to be the heir of Julius Caesar, but instead it's Octavius. So Octavius turned out to be an able ruler, and he became Caesar then, took the name Caesar Augustus, ruled, and was followed by Tiberius, and Tiberius was followed by Caligula, and in Caligula's day there was a coup to overthrow the government, and so Caligula was murdered, and the whole Roman household was slated for murder in this coup. And Claudius, though, while he was a member of the Roman household, he wasn't involved in politics, and he didn't really have the appearance of an emperor. He was kind of a sickly person. Historians don't know if he had cerebral palsy or if he suffered from some other childhood illness, but for some reason he was kind of a sickly person. He kind of frail looking, and so he wasn't considered a threat, and so he wasn't very high on the list of people who they were assassinating. And so as this assassination was being carried out, some Praetorian guards, discovered Claudius, recognized who he was, and called him the first person. And so these Praetorian guards guarded him, they whisked him away, put him in a safe place until the coup was squashed, and then Claudius ascended to the throne, came to power, and actually turned out to be a very good emperor. He was emperor of Rome for 13 years. He started his reign in 41, and he instituted some reforms. For example, he was one of the things that people would do before Claudius, if they had a slave who was sick, they would take this slave, put him on an island. Instead of giving him medical care, they would take this slave and just ship him off to some island to die. But if the slave happened to recover, then the master would go back and reclaim the slave. And so Claudius, he put an end to that. He said, no, he says, if you ship the slave off to die and he recovers, he's a free man after that. And Claudius, he did other reforms. It was common that there was a period of hunger in the winter months because they couldn't get food into Rome. And so one of Claudius's reforms is he began to subsidize and insure the ships that traveled in the wintertime. He negotiated with the owner of the ship to insure the ship, to entice the owners to make the dangerous winter voyage to bring food into the city of Rome. So he was a well-liked ruler, an able administrator. He had a kind of a penchant for history and law, and he would often sit in trials and Senate debates and so on, and is an active participant. For some reason, nobody knows why exactly, Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome, and conservative commentators think that was around the year 49 or 50 AD, that he kicked the Jews out of Rome. Nobody knows why exactly. But he did. He kicked the Jews out of Rome, and so that is why Aquila and Priscilla ended up in Corinth, one of the major cities in the Roman Empire. So anyway, as we continue here, verse 3, so Paul, verse 3, because he was of the same craft as Aquila and Priscilla, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. So Paul came from Tarsus in the region of Sicily, and that region was known for these black goat hair tents. And interestingly, Pontius, the kingdom of the empire of Pontius, was also known for these same tents. So Paul and Aquila, both in Corinth at the same time, as tent makers, would have been selling these tents. Now, what was it that would make this tent such a lucrative trade at this time of year? Well, it was the Isthmian Games were coming to town. So it's a known fact that in the year 51, the Isthmian Games were held in Corinth, and they had people from all over the empire come to Corinth for these games, and they needed tents. They needed tents to stay, to set up for this big festival, for this big thing. So Paul and his companions were there making these highly regarded tents, and so they would have been able to do a brisk business there. And besides that, Corinth was also a major seaport city, having two ports. Corinth being located on the isthmus, having a port in the Aegean Sea and a port in the Adriatic Sea. And they transported cargo from one port to another port. It was safer to sail to Corinth and transport the cargo 4 miles across the Corinthian isthmus than it was to take the dangerous journey all the way around the end of, I can't remember the name of that big point, but to take the dangerous journey all the way around. It was cheaper and safer to sail to Corinth, offload the cargo, drag it 4 miles to the other port, load it back on the ship, and then send it on its way to take that dangerous journey. So cargo was Corinth. The city of Corinth was a major seaport, and on these ships they used tents. People who booked passage on these ships, on these shipping vessels, when you paid for a cabin, you didn't get a nice cabin under the deck someplace with a bed and a toilet and a commode and so on. No, you slept on the deck. It was a deck, and so they would nail tents to the deck of the ship, and in order to make their way around. So that was the shipping. The tent business was brisk there in Corinth, and Paul and Aquila were tent makers. So, verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So notice that Paul worked during the week, meaningful work, the type of work that the world wanted to have done. It was very important to have a trade. So Paul, not only did he have a trade, but he was also an educated man. So I remember reading Booker T. Washington's autobiography. Booker T. Washington was a slave. He grew up as a slave in the South. He was born, I think he said in 1859, born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, shortly before the Civil War. So the Civil War broke out in 1860. By 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation came out, all the slaves were freed. So Booker T. Washington was a small child when he was emancipated. And his desire, he was hungry to get an education. And so he worked at various jobs until he was able to save enough money to get an education. And his autobiography is a fascinating story of how he managed to get this education. He went to college. He went on to found a college of his own, Tuskegee University in Alabama, very, very famous black college. But what was prominent throughout his autobiography was his love of work and his view of work, physical work. So he wanted to get an education, but he also valued work. And he thought that the two should go hand in hand. He said that too many people viewed education as a ticket to get away from work. He said that wasn't the way to look at it. He said it was much more wholesome to look at education as the complementing work, the complementing the trade, so that if you couldn't get a job as in some kind of field that required an education, you could fall back on your trade as a tradesman of some kind. And so that's very much the philosophy that the Jews had. So the Jewish community, when they raised their kids, they were expected to give their kids an education, circumcision, and a trade. These were the three things that was required of the Jewish father to take care of his son. So Paul and Aquila learned these trades, and they applied these trades. And Paul reasoned in the synagogue on the Sabbath. So this honest work, so Paul's honest work prepared him for the Sabbath. And so the Sabbath was something he looked forward to as a refreshment from his work. He preached on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath refreshment prepared him to go back to work on Monday, and refreshed and renewed. So it's this cycle of rest that he worked through the Sabbath. So Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So by the Greeks there, he would have meant the Greek proselytes, the Greeks who would have recognized or been disillusioned with all of the sin in Corinth. You see, Corinth was an extremely wicked city. Corinth had a number of temples and temple prostitutes. One of the temples we saw in the presentation last week, on top of the mountain, 1,800 feet above the city of Corinth, was this famous temple. I think it was a temple to Apollos. It had 1,000 temple prostitutes. These temple prostitutes were slaves. They were bought in the slave market by wealthy citizens and donated to the temple. And then the maintenance of these slaves was managed by the city treasury. So the city treasury paid for the food and the lodging and so on for this temple prostitute. So the temple prostitutes would go into the city and practice their trade in the city. 1,000 of them. And there were other prostitutes as well. It was a very incredibly wicked city, very evil. In the Preacher's Homiletical Handbook, it says that traveling to Corinth, from Athens to Corinth, would have been like going from Cambridge to Las Vegas. You couldn't think of a more bigger disparity between these two cities. One was a smaller, sensible city into this outrageous city where all this sin was taking place. So Corinth was a very wicked place with all of these prostitutes running around. And the Greeks would become disillusioned with this. They would see all this sin, become disillusioned with this. And there was an appeal, there was something appealing about the Jewish religion that was one God. And so there was Greeks who would attend the Jewish synagogue, and they were called the God-fearing Greeks. So Paul was reasoning with the God-fearing Greeks and the Jews. And now verse 5, and when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in his spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So now finally, Paul's friends come from up north. So they are in Macedonia. They are still ministering in Thessalonica. They're ministering in Berea or Philippi or wherever they were ministering. And they finally come to Paul in Corinth. Now that they've come to Paul in Corinth, now they bring this money, these offerings, these gifts from Philippi and the other cities to support Paul in his ministry. And Paul was pressed in the spirit. That means he was eager, and he testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. So Paul was testifying that Jesus was the Christ. Verse 6, and when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go to the Gentiles. So as Paul was preaching to the Jews, they opposed, that word in the King James themselves means that they opposed Paul and his party. They opposed Paul and blasphemed. So the word blasphemed, in the modern sense of blaspheming, we think of blaspheming as somebody who curses Christ. But in the King James, blaspheming is a softer word. it means rejecting Christ. It's not as harsh. It's not as strong. The meaning is not as strong as we take it today. So the Jews, what this is saying is the Jews rejected Christ as the Messiah. And so Paul, verse 6, shook his raiment. So you'll remember that Jesus said to shake the dust off of your feet when you come to a town and it rejects the message and so on, shake the dust off of your feet. Well, this is if you were traveling outside of Jerusalem or outside of Israel, and you came back in, you would shake the dust off your feet before you would come back into Israel. You didn't want to bring any bad dust into Israel. But this is the idea, if you're already there, instead of taking the dust off of your feet, you shake your clothes, but it's the same idea. You shake your clothes out that you want to shake off. It's a sign that you don't want any of these bad ideas to stick to you. So Paul shook out his raiment, and he said unto them, your blood be upon your own heads. So this is an Old Testament idea, your blood be upon your own heads. It's, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 3. I'll turn there for a minute. Ezekiel chapter 3. So Ezekiel is by the Kaibar River in Babylon. The nation has been hauled off to Babylon. And here God appears to Ezekiel as he's sitting by the river. And Ezekiel has a series of visions. And in one of these visions, God speaks to Ezekiel. And he says to him that chapter 3, verse 18, and when I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, thou shalt givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his way, to save his life. The same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but look, verse, his blood will I require at thy hand. So God was telling Ezekiel that if he didn't preach a message of repentance to the nation of Israel, God will require the blood from him. But God goes on to say that if Ezekiel fulfills his responsibility and tells the nation of Israel, warns them against their wickedness, warns them of the judgment that is to come, warns them of the impending doom, and they don't turn from their wickedness, then the blood is on their own head, because Ezekiel has fulfilled his obligations to warn them. And so that's what Paul is saying here to the Jews. He's picking up that Old Testament idea, warning the Jews that the blood, that he has warned them, and that if they suffer judgment, that their blood will be on their own heads, not on his head, because he fulfilled his obligations to tell them of Christ. So Paul continues here at the end of verse 6, I am clean, from henceforth I will go to the Gentiles. Verse 7, and he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house was joined hard to the synagogue. So this idea of joined hard means it was right next door. Paul walked out of this door, walked over and went into the next door over, the next house. The next house was owned by Justus, and historians and scholars think this is Gaius Titus Justus, who's referred to here as Justus, entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one who worshipped God. So Justus was a Christian. His house, he worshipped God, and his house was right next door to the synagogue. Verse 8, and Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all of his house. And look, and many of the Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. Many of the, in this city of incredible wickedness, in this city of incredible sin, Paul is preaching, and many became Christians and were baptized. Now you can see the conflict stirring here. So many people became Christians. The church is right next door to the synagogue. The synagogue is angry. The people of the synagogue rulers are angry, unhappy, and there is massive tension between these two groups. And Paul is honestly scared. And we know that he's scared because of what comes up next. Verse 9. Then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision. This is what the Lord says to Paul, verse 9. Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Amazing. Amazing verse. God speaks to the Apostle Paul, reaches down into that chaos, into those circumstances where people were getting saved. There was opposition to the gospel. And you remember Paul, as we have seen as through his journeys, that he's been beaten, flogged, shipwrecked, stoned, driven out of the city multiple times. And here Paul was in this city of incredible wickedness, and his fears caught up with him. If we flip over to 1 Corinthians for a moment, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says this as he's writing to the Corinthians some years later. 1 Corinthians 2:1, and brethren, when I came to you, I came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. Look in verse 3. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And in my speech and my preaching was not enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So Paul here says that he came to Corinth in fear and trembling. And God, in a moment of comfort, appears to him and says, fear not. So many times throughout the Bible, when heaven intersects with this material world, when God shows up, the first thing he said, fear not. You see this with Abraham. God told Abraham, fear not. You see it with Isaac. Fear not. You see it with Jacob. You see it with Abraham's wife Hagar. He appears in the desert, fear not. You see it with Daniel. When the angel appears to Daniel, fear not. You see it with Mary. When the angel appears to Mary, first thing he says, fear not. When the angel appears to John on the island of Patmos, fear not. When the angel appears to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, he says, fear not. So here we have in a vision, God appearing to Paul saying, fear not. God doesn't want us to fear. God doesn't want us to live in fear of the society and the circumstances around us. He wants us to live in boldness and confidence. He tells Paul, fear not. And then he continues on, but speak and hold not thy peace. So God is desirous that Paul is in this exact city, this great city of great wickedness, is right where God wants Paul to be. In this incredible, tumultuous situation. It is speak the truth. Speak out. And God says in verse 10, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Amazingly. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And it's so interesting to compare this vision with the other visions that Paul has. So I have a list of the other visions. So 5 times in the book of Acts, Paul has a vision of one kind or another. You remember the first vision was Acts chapter 9, where Christ appeared to Paul, and then when Ananias gets a vision, it says that God had to show Paul how much things he must suffer for his sake. And then Paul gets a vision at Troas, Acts 16, that God is directing him to go to Macedonia. He sees the man of Macedonia calling him to come preach in Macedonia. And then when Paul is giving his testimony before the crowd, which we haven't gotten to yet, Acts 22, Paul says that he was in Jerusalem early on in his ministry, and he had a vision, and God told him to leave the city of Jerusalem. So in that situation, Acts 22, the vision, God told him to leave, get out of the city, because they would not receive his testimony. And here in Acts 18, God told him to stay in the city and speak, because they would receive his testimony. And then in Acts 23, we see another vision. Paul is in prison, and he has another vision. And God appears to him and says that he must go to Rome, that Paul must witness in Rome. And Paul had other visions. We see in Corinthians, I think 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul has another, it wasn't a vision, but the Lord spoke to him and told him that my grace is sufficient for thee. And Paul also talks in 2 Corinthians about being caught up into the third heaven. So Paul has these visions, but here in this vision, in Acts 18, God is encouraging Paul to speak, hold not thy peace, because God is with thee. So verse 11, and he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. Let's see. Just looking at our time, wondering if we want to try to continue on here. I think with the time being what it is, I'm going to close here today, and we'll pick up and continue in Corinthians 18 next week. Hallelujah.